So I'm Fleishman. I'm the 2017 designer in residence, and so that means my time's up. So thank you for coming. We scheduled this in 2018. I do have a presentation prepared. I'm going to review my year in residence, and I'm also incidentally going to cover about 6 centuries of printing, and we're going to tie it all together with lasers. So this will be great. So just a little background on who I am, just to overwhelm you a little bit, because my life typically involves, a regular year involves writing hundreds of articles. I've written for many different publications since the mid-1990s about technology, business, and science, New York Times, The Economist, Wired, Macro, and a lot of others. But I studied graphic design in college, and I worked as a typesetter before that, and I helped put myself through school as a typesetter. So at some level, I still consider myself a little bit of, type geek and someone in that world, even though I've spent most of my working life as a journalist and a writer. I decided I was better suited to writing than designing, and I've spent a lot of time, when I can, in half in each world, explaining design to people in technology and writing about technology for designers. And if you just want to see, these are a few other professions I've had over the years, and it is true, I was actually paid once, literally paid, to write high-quality gibberish for a friend who needed some for a radio ad. So how did I wind up here? Well, these fine people, if you don't know them all, Larry, you just met. Jenny Wilkson at the left has run the letterpress program here since its inception a number of years ago. Linda Hunt and Larry Asher are the co-directors. I got sucked in because I had a set of articles that I'd written largely about aspects of type and printing and typography and language. They sort of fit together as a set. And a friend of mine sent me this email early in the year when I was trying to figure out what to do with myself. As a freelance writer, it's a constant process of reinvention to be able to make a living and just, figure out something that's interesting and meaningful to do. And he said, you don't have to find 100,000 people to like what you do. Find like 100. And I thought, well, maybe I should put some of this stuff together as a book. I'll make a short book, and that'll be a great thing to start the year of the creative project. And I thought, well, I'll just ask around, see if I can find some cheap bids for printing. I'll do something modest. And I called Jenny and said, because I'd taken a letterpress class from her and kept up, and said, maybe you have a referral for where I can get this printed. And she said, of course, well, you should become our first designer in residence and print your book with letterpress. And I said, of course, yes, that's what I want to do. And more accurately, I discussed it with my wife because it's a big time commitment. And Jenny made sure that Linda and Larry were okay with it. And it all happened. Everyone said, yes, you have to do this. And there we go. And you'll see, as I explain this, I'm going to explain it very earnestly. You'll be just as interested as my children are here. Just explaining letterpress. So I really had 2 goals this year, and they were pretty straightforward. Print a book and connect to digital creators, footnote, raise money. And since I'm recording this, I'll say thank you to all the Kickstarter backers I'll mention in a moment who've helped support me through 2 projects this year. And some of you are in the audience as well, I realize, so thank you. So SVC gave me classes, a place to work, mentorship, support. I took workshops here, and I just met and got to be part of this community, and that really helped an enormous amount. And part of the exchange was I was going to be spreading the word about letterpress in general. Why is this a relevant and interesting thing in a time of digital creation? And also, hey, maybe where you could take classes in letterpress and workshops, maybe that would be a good idea. So I took a lot of courses. I recovered some muscle memory. Here's one project I did. I had to remember about not just things that I'd learned I've done some letterpress in the late 1980s. I'd taken a class from Jenny in 2011. And had to recover that memory and really get myself up to speed to be a real printer. And I rebuilt some of my design and sketching muscles to remember how to conceive of projects and then bring them into something that actually looked like some approximation of what I imagined. And this whole process of taking classes, and I took 3 classes in the first quarter last year, and that helped me also just get to know the community and meet the people who are part of the backbone here, which I'll circle back to later. Now, the coincidental thing that happened is while I was trying to think about making this book, Kickstarter came up with a project. Kickstarter is a crowdfunding site. I'm sure is anybody not familiar with Kickstarter? I'm curious about how everybody knows. It's pretty amazing. I will tell them because I feel like it has reached a kind of oxygen level among creative people. So they had a campaign in January 2017 that they're redoing this year that they called Make 100. And the idea was they wanted to jumpstart people at a time when people felt a little bit crushed. What could you do? Make 100 of something. It could be, you could sign 100 slips of paper. You could have a performance with 100 people attending, or make an edition of 100 books. And it was a great prod to people. They had almost 500 people participate in the Make 100 event last year. Like I say, they're redoing it this January, and so far I haven't come up with a 100 idea. I don't know if I'm gonna. It's so tempting. And after doing the budgeting, I realized I'd have to, in order to underwrite the costs of all different components, which I'll talk about a bit later, that I'd have to do an edition and charge $100 a copy for numbered and signed editions. That seemed like a really big ask, and I was nervous about it, and I planned for partial failure, that maybe I would sell some of the books in the Kickstarter campaign, and then I would sell others later. Now, the good news is people really, my friend who said, you know, you can easily find 100 people who want to help you do this and want to support you and also want to get something interesting that you're doing. And that turned out to be terrific. This is the sales chart on Kickstarter, and within 3 days had sold all 100 editions, and then ultimately raised about almost $13,000 with additional keepsakes and ebook versions and so forth. And so this all covered the expenses of the project. I'll probably land the whole project with a little bit of money to spare, maybe not, but it's going to be close to on the bubble. That's the plan, and part of it will be how many books I get bound and whether I sell author's proofs beyond the edition of 100 at the end. So there's still a few details with that to go. And I should note, well, I'll tell you that later. The project is still underway, but very close to completion. You know, so when I was an undergrad, I really loved my undergrad design education. And I got a BA, and I looked at what the Masters of Fine Arts students were doing, and I thought, that's not exactly for me. I'm much more practical. I want to go out and do something. So one of the things I got out of this year is, this was the equivalent for me of an MFA. I had mentorship, I had a project, I had a thesis, I had writing, I had to raise the money for it, and I was given this incredible educational facility and community, part of, put on paper, an MFA, but I feel like this residency, for me, was the equivalent of whatever I would ever have wanted out of one. And I got that with all of the support of SVC and all the folks who helped fund these projects that I did. So I'll get into printing the book, I promise, because that's really one of the things I did this year, right? But there's something that's hard to miss about SVC. You may have noticed. Amazon tends to dominate the landscape nearby. Probably why it took everyone a while to get here. And I've been telling this joke as I've traveled around the country this year meeting people. And I've said, when I started at SVC, Amazon was 2 blocks away. Then it was a block away. Now it's across the street. And some people laugh. They think I'm exaggerating. I was just in London a few weeks ago, and they just said, oh, yeah, we understand. We understand. London and Seattle, it's kind of scary how fast things are growing there. People are like, well, you know, you walk down the street. Well, that hit was that historic building. It's the same conversations we have here, only on a scale 10 times larger and with even more money getting poured in than we are having. So, you know, Amazon dominates the landscape around here. We talk about it all the time. It's literally chewing up the environment. It's a positive, destructive force. It's bringing in jobs. It's technological innovation. And because I want to roll time backwards and talk about the history of printing, of course, I'm going to make this perfectly natural segue to talk about, of course, we have that connection across the street. So, you know, a lot of builds, some fences. I think it's made a lot more progress since I was here last. And now let's roll back to the year 1450. It's all tied together. So 6 centuries of printing. We're just a few minutes. Okay, hang on. So what we start with is, this is something I wrote a bunch of stuff I'll talk about later in this presentation this year about the history of printing. I wound up living partly in the 19th century, I feel like, this summer especially. And one of the things that I think I learned that I didn't quite understand is that when you say Gutenberg invented movable type, you say, what did Gutenberg invent? People will say automatically, movable type. Well, what does that mean? It's this whole set of innovations and things. And he didn't invent it because in China, Korea, and Japan, movable type already existed in different forms centuries before, maybe even 1,500 years before. What he did is, I liken him to Steve Jobs because he brought together a lot of different technologies that were extant, and he made modifications and pulled them together, clearly hired a lot of brilliant people and pushed them super hard, and especially in a time of guilds when everything was separated, that the people making paper would never have talked to the people making ink, the Goldsmiths Union, the mints, all these things. He brought all this together somehow, and he wanted to make a book that looked as good as one that was written by scribes. What he probably really actually only invented, and that's kind of the crux of it, was a way of making, it wasn't, movable type as one concept. Really, it was a way of rapidly creating individual pieces of type that was through a process that would have been familiar to goldsmiths at the time, because goldsmiths and coin makers at mints had already been using, making punches to stamp a design out. You see, there's a couple different examples. I'll point your fingers there. On the left, those are two examples of punches, kind of a different view. You carve a punch out of carve a punch out of steel, rather. Smith would work at it with extremely hardened tools on slightly softer steel to make a design that could be stamped into something else. Now, sometimes that was an original thing that was stamped into softer metal, and that was your final piece, like a work of gold. But Smiths also knew how to make a punch that was a mirror of what they wanted. That would be stamped into a matrix, which is just to the right. The matrix could be used to make a mold, and the mold would produce a final piece that looked like the thing you wanted to be right reading. So if you look from left to right here, on the top there's a punch, the matrix the punch is stamped into, and then a piece of type that was poured into this mold and it can now be printed with. The bottom illustration shows the mold stage in the middle a little more clearly. So punch, matrix, which is softer metal like copper, and then put into a mold, hot metal is poured in, and then you get a piece of type at the end. So this is the interesting part to me. What I feel like Gutenberg really invented is not even this process, which was known at least in a lot of different ways. He did not invent this. What he invented is the adjustable hand mold, which is the least sexy thing you could talk about printing. Like, so if somebody asks you, what did Gutenberg invent? He invented the adjustable hand mold. Like, well, kind of, but anyway. So that's really what it was. Is it's a way to hold a design in your hand, or a sort of piece of a mold in your hand that you could put one of these matrices in, and that had essentially a kind of mold itself. You put it in, and it had screws or other settings to adjust the width. So these are, the left is the complete piece put together. On the right, it's broken into two. And because you could do it adjustably, it meant that every piece of type you set could have the right width. Adjustable width type in the Western world, in Roman languages, Latin script, allows you to set and print things that look like something a scribe would write. So there's some dispute about how much Gutenberg actually invented and when he did it. So there are court cases. We know most of what we know about Gutenberg from court cases. The man was sued a lot. He broke off an engagement and got sued in Strasbourg because they sued him for breaking it off and countersued. There's a lawsuit in Strasbourg that mentions some kind of weird device with screws in it. And people are sort of convinced that it probably was an early prototype he was having made, and not telling people all the reasons why he's having these pieces made because he's keeping it secret. Because you can imagine, if you've read anything about the history of printing, the second people understand what he did, they start replicating it because the idea is so much more powerful than the difficulty of making the parts to do it. He had a viral idea, right? Steve Jobs, this is what I say. So Gutenberg at least created many of the parts of this, if not exactly what it was. He may not have created the hand mold exactly in this form, but it had to be something pretty efficient given the amount of type they set in his workshop. And at least by, say, 1475, maybe a little bit later, something that's very similar to this existed. So he improved paper, ink. He modified presses that were used for wine or other purposes for wood that had already been used for woodblock printing. They improved binding. The book format already existed. Everything already existed. The hand mold did not. Now, just a side note, if you're interested in reading a fascinating book that puts you in what feels like the workshop of the master, The Gutenberg's Apprentice came out a few years ago by Alex Christie. And because the world is built on coincidence, I had this trip planned to London, and my friends in London I'm staying with say, oh, would you like to meet Alex Christie? She wrote this book, and I'm like, I love you. Okay, so I had dinner. They invited her over for dinner. We had a great talk about things. And her grandfather had been a printer at a hot metal shop, Mackenzie and Harris, in San Francisco. He ran Red Squirrel Press, was his own press, and he was very unpretentious. He did not like fancy typesetting people and whatever. So he created this thing that she brought that is it's a Gettysburg's Address, and it's this big, set in 4-point type. It is the most beautiful, but also very ordinary book. Like, it's not fancy, but it's beautifully printed. And the case is like shelf liner paper around like tile or something. And the book sits in there like you're a hollowed out place for a bottle of alcohol. Anyway, she's also a letterpress printer and terrific book. But I just love the coincidence of that and seeing this super tiny book. So last day I was in London, I got to see the smallest book I've ever seen. So hand molds make it possible to produce the amount of type necessary in Western languages, which have a small character set. The sidebar there is, even though in Asian countries, various kinds of movable type printing have been invented, most of the Han languages have thousands and thousands of characters, even for simplified stories and so forth. And so because the Roman language really, and even Gutenberg made a lot of punctuation and ligatures and combinations of letters, you don't need that many. He had maybe a couple hundred different letters that he had to create separate designs for, as opposed to thousands that were often much more complicated than our simplified script. So that's part of it. So hand molds were used for centuries, from the 1400s to the 1800s. They were the predominant way to make type until the rise of type foundries that could cast type on a commercial scale. You can still find them. It's not like they disappeared because people saved things. So on my trip to London, the top are boxes and boxes of them. I mean, there's so many. They're labeled, there's 3, there's 16, whatever, just in the collection of the St. Bride Printing Library in London, which is just off Fleet Street. It's like the last connection to printing that's on Fleet Street in London. And the bottom is just an exhibition case that's currently in storage at the Type Archive. Also in London, they're just sitting there, and they've got piles more in boxes as well. However, and I know several people in the room were at this, if you just happen to wander around the extension to Suzzallo, you can just wander in a room there one night, and somebody's just pouring type like it's the old days. This is Joe Green, who is a poet and printer. He's on the board of the C.C. Stern Type Foundry in Portland. He was giving a demonstration for the Book Arts Guild, and he had a portable heater that is apparently very handy now to heat up the lead amalgam, which is a very low boiling point. And he had a modern glove, so he wasn't going to burn himself. But I'm going to show you a little bit of a, let's see, start automatically. So here's the action, and you can see some close-ups on the left and right. He just picks up the lead, he has to put it in there, and you jog it, so it fills the whole thing out. And what it's doing is you have the top part, the matrix, but then the whole shaft has to get poured at the same time. So when it comes out, audio on. He pulls out the whole thing, and you can see the shaft, and also a little bit at the end that gets cut off his cast, and the leather. And that is exactly how type was set, more or less. It was a cast for hundreds of years, and you can still see it today. So this is just an amazing thing. Again, a coincidence of the year. I was meeting Jules Fay, I'll talk about later. He's a bookbinder. I hadn't meant to go to this meeting at all, and I got to see someone who cast up. It was beautiful. So hundreds of years pass and almost nothing changes, as was the way of things from the Renaissance through the Industrial Age. Most of the things associated with printing remain relatively constant. It's still a cottage industry. So you still have people, there's a book by a guy named Moxon in which he describes this long book. You get a copy of it from the 1600s. And it's basically how to build your print shop. And it's like, cut the wood this dimension, saw it like this, make an oven, make the bricks like such and such. It is, you literally, if you follow the directions today, and I'm surprised no one has done it, maybe someone has, you can just build a print shop from scratch. It doesn't tell you anything really about type. It's mostly about how to make all the ovens and metal parts and presses, and all the presses were made of wood. There were very little metal parts even in the presses. So there was a limit of what could be done, even though these printers, even in Gutenberg's day, they would print hundreds and hundreds of sheets a day. And you try to do the math about, they had to wet all the paper and get it in these huge presses and use this incredible manual effort to, two people pulling stuff down and pull it off and get it off to dry without smearing the ink. And you're thinking, well, they work 12 or 16 hours a day in all kinds of lighting conditions, and they were still just whipping paper in and out of that, even as they were literally inventing what printing was. So that's an incredible thing when labor is very cheap and human life is cheap also. So people get worked to death, and well, that's just the way it is. You're going to die of the plague anyway. You might as well die of overwork when you've done something meaningful. So in the 18th century, this is what's, and mostly in the 19th century, this is why I say I spent some of this year living, or last year living in the 19th century, is that I found out about what I don't think I fully appreciated, even having studied design and printing and the history of it in the past. I think I studied too shallow a level. Because I thought of the 20th century as this profound change in printing and how it was incredibly disruptive and upsetting to people. And every 10 years there'd be a revolution. The 19th century was much worse because it was the transition of crafts didn't work as well. You learned one profession, your entire family might have done it for generations, and then suddenly that craft was no longer needed at all, or they could take boys and teach them and have them running it in an hour or something. So it was a profoundly upsetting time for people, clearly. And also, with the Industrial Revolution, people really were being treated like and so things sped up, but it was still a lot of manual operation with machines now speeding things up. But the human component, we can only work so fast. So this is just a bunch of different things all happening almost at the same time. The Fourdrinier machine at the upper, wait, is it upper right? No, I'm forgetting which machines are which. The Fourdrinier machine is one of these is a paper making machine. I can't tell from my drawing. An automated production of a roll of paper. So paper was being pressed one sheet at a time, and sometimes quite large sheets. The Fourdrinier machine was a method of using like heated rollers and rotating parts and so forth, so that a slurry could be fed through and a roll of paper could be made all at once. And that opens this whole potential, not just for making paper faster, but eventually for feeding it through a press, a cylinder press that feeds paper through continuously and cuts it at the end. So there's 2 examples of cylinder presses in there as well that allow, again, instead of sheet at a time, which is a lot of manual effort, continuous feed. Lithography was invented right around 1800, which is a flat or planographic technique. So I'll show you a slide in a second, the difference. But lithography, originally you drew a stone and you used materials that would attract ink or resist ink. So oleophobic and oleophilic, or water also could be the other way around. And but it was a flat process. So you didn't use, I'll show you. These are the 3 kinds of generally accepted kinds of printing. Letterpress in the far left is relief. So it's a raised surface in which you apply ink. You press paper into it, and the ink is pressed in. In the middle is something I won't talk about in this presentation, but it's intaglio or intaglio printing, which is in size, and the ink is pushed into below the surface, and then paper is pressed on it, and it's almost a capillary action pressure that raises it into the paper, and that's how a lot of stamps are printed. It's intaglio or intaglio. And then the third on the far right, this is from a great 1946 book on advertising that I've fallen in love with, of all things. It's an advertising production standards book for the New York Times that tells you everything about every printing technique in 1946. And so on the far right is planography, where the ink essentially rests the film on the surface, and it's just a contact process. You need different inks and different processes. You're not using pressure to transfer ink. It's more a process of getting a film to go from one surface to another. And I will come back to that. So, with me so far, we're 400 years in now, just about. So that's the 19th century, and here's one of the key advantages. This will tie back into my book, I promise you. So from about you're gonna love what this is, I'll tell you here in a second. From about 1450 until about 1800, all printing involved taking a set of type and option engravings or other kinds of materials, putting them together in a form, and locking them together into a rigid frame, which is typically called a chase, and then you load it into a press, and then you ink it, and you put paper, and you squeeze it against it, and there you go. So all the material printed was original, in the sense that every piece of type was an original piece of type that had been cast. Even if it was a duplicate, it was still like your single piece of type, hardwood, your illustration. But type wears, especially metal type wears relatively quickly as you print, and when you're printing in large quantities, large numbers of the same thing, the type starts to work its way out. You have to lock it down again, and it can get crushed in the process. It's a whole deal. And type was a fairly handmade product, even when it was being made in the 1800s on a commercial scale. Reading these things, these original documents about you just hire young girls, I mean literally girls, to be working on these tables because they're very good at filing down the bottoms of the type. And it's just terrifying what they had children doing. Literally, so it's a very hard thing on people again. So type was still expensive and relatively scarce. Printers needed a lot of type, and if you wanted to print a book on multiple presses at once, you had to set the same material multiple times. So you had different forms set up, and then you could put them in different presses. It was very inefficient, and there's a lot of issues I'll get to with that in a moment too. So the stereotype changed this, and you probably know the word stereotype as a modern figurative word. It's a printing plate. It was the first printing plate, and the words mean durable type, stereotypos, very easy. Were coined at that time. It was developed a bunch of times in the 18th century, and people will tell you different dates about when the stereotype was created. But it really came into its own at the early 1800s because you needed an industrial revolution to drive the speed. And before that, you also had guilds and unions that were like, look, we have all these typesetters here, you can kind of work if you can make duplicates of things. And so let's say a stereotype is a really hard to use photocopying machine. It's like a mimeograph except for metal. And this is my favorite word in 2017 is flong. F-L-O-N-G. And I heard someone use it in 2017 when I was visiting the Type Archive. Sue Shaw, who runs it, is a force of nature, a wonderful person. She's in her 80s and has kept this thing together through force of will for 20 years. She said, well, you know, when they got rid of all the stereotypes, they burned all the flaw. And I was like, oh, I know what you mean. This is wonderful. And what she's saying is they didn't keep, they used stereotypes for many, many years. And in terms of what was saved from the printing industry, they threw out everything. And flaw was made of various materials at various times. In the 1800s, flaw was paste, carefully noted as non-flammable paste, because you heat it up, blotting paper and tissue paper. It's all sort of permeated together. And then you set your type up as if you were going to go and press. And there's actually like a special chase you use and so forth. And but you set it up exactly as if it were going to press. And then you put it on a flong table. This is a flong table. And that man is holding a flong brush. He's beating the flong with a flong brush. You have to do it very carefully because you're beating all the type carefully in some gesture into, there's books, this is why I know all this, there's books on like the stereotype process from 1825. And it's delightful because they're saying it's a practical manual of instruction. You just get it on Google Books and find out what they were doing at that time. With the flong brush. And so that it fits all the crevices. It's essentially like, if you remember a mimeograph, it's the same kind of thing. It's like you would type on a mimeograph and then knock stuff out, and then you'd take the thing off and you could run it. You'd fill with ink and fill the spaces and you'd run it off. This is a way of making a metal duplicate because you would take the flong, you would heat the flong under pressure. It would dry, it would be removed, and you have a mold of exactly what you set. Then you fill it with type metal. You raise it to type high, which is the height necessary for printing in any letterpress environment. And then you have a plate that you can, or sometimes, I should say that sometimes you make the metal and you put it on a base, but anyway, you get it to the point where you can print, but it's a duplicate of your form, and you can make multiples of them. And sometimes you make one because you're preserving the type, and you weren't trying to print something multiple different times. Other times, you can make a bunch of these things from the same type, or make multiple flongs because you were worried that the impression wasn't as good when you reused the mold. But in any case, you could suddenly print something simultaneously. You could distribute your type and use it for other jobs. So it transformed the nature and speed of printing. It was really a remarkable innovation. And here's a later version of the same thing. And this is what Sue was talking about, which said they burned all the flong. This is a later process, you can see by the outfit, somebody in the 1930s or 40s, where they had newspapers just had these much more automated system where prefab material would go on, they put it in a machine, there was dry flong and wet flong, and they would whip these things out. I was reading this production book, how quickly they could go from something being typeset at the New York Times, locked up, sent to the flong department, the stereotype department, I want to call it the flong department. And the stereotype department would have plates out in like minutes. And the quantity would go through thousands of pounds of metal a night producing stereotypes for printing.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was used to pour the mold in, or to?
It's wild, yeah, because this was rigid enough. I know it doesn't look like anything. It looks like you're looking at like a dough or something, but it's just hard enough that it would contain a perfect impression because you just need almost a slightly more than a shell.
Yeah.
It's just astonishing. There's tons of photos online when you start searching for flaw. And unlike the rest of the internet, there's nothing dirty comes up. Flaw is just flaw. Nobody's changed that word to anything. And I'll just pass to, I mentioned this is, you might have only heard this word in you might have only heard this word. There's no Rule 35 on the flaw. You might have, I started out talking about stereotypes being a figurative word, and in fact, stereotype, the origin is this. It's from this making of stereotypes, and it became something, right? You know, it's a thing you tell about people, and because it's like a notion, a fixed notion you have of somebody, right? Cliché is also from the same thing. In France and in England, they typically call this a cliché because it made the sound when printing, cliché, 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 which the plate made and nothing else made. And that's the story, at least. It's onomatopoetic. And a cliché, obviously, also something that happened here again and again and again. Typecasting, also not as clear, but it may also come from the same origin of casting type, and thus people stuck in the same rut. So, something else you can do with a stereotype is you can bend them around a cylinder. And this is why newspapers love this, because suddenly You can use a rotary press and continuous rolls of paper. And the plates, instead of being flat and people are going like this and papers moving in and out, or the papers going through and whatever, suddenly you have multiple units of things linked together so that front and backs of newspapers can be printed once. They can be printed at super fast quantities. They can be printed simultaneously so you get two presses set up instead of one. It transforms the speed of information. It's, you know, the internet of its time is suddenly the scale of what can be printed. If you ever wondered in studying things in other topics, why at the end of the 1800s, a lot is paper became cheaper. They figured out how to make cheap wood pulp paper, which is true. But the other is they figured out how to print more things and faster. I'm going to all of this step. Oh, this, by the way, these images, this is, there's a little flaw in that because that's a printing plate from the Financial Times, I think it says, and the flaw that goes with it. At the St. Bride Library, which has a letterpress studio set up a few years ago, and they have demonstration things, and they have a little display of the history of printing as well as active presses there. You'll see next to it something I'll show on the next slide, which are matrices. We're going to all this depth about stereotypes. You may wonder, where is Glenn going with this? Didn't he print a book? Why are we talking about the 1800s? And I swear, this all comes back together about what I was actually doing this year. And I put a placeholder here because it actually is related. Partly because the question is, are stereotypes printing? And I think they are printing, but they're also imitation of printing. You're not printing the original thing. You're printing a thing that's an image or duplicate of a thing. So are you printing the thing you printed? Sorry, I got all philosophical. So, other big bottleneck. There's more of this, but we're going to get there, I promise. We're almost through the history of printing and into one of the other big bottlenecks in printing was creating enough type and then typesetting fast enough. So in the 1880s, the Benton pantograph, which is machine, one of the kinds, is the machine at the left here, broke from 400 years of type creation. Because for 400 years, every piece of type that was made required the carving of a punch. Every punch was carved at exactly the size of the piece of type. You had this remarkable scope of craftspeople who are carving sometimes 4-point type. Yes, there was 4-point, even 3.5-point type, which I did not know, in the 1700s and the 1800s. There are names for these sizes of type. So you have these people losing their eyesight, carving with super sharp steel, and every punch was a unique object because you couldn't duplicate punches. They're in hardened steel. So if your punch broke, you had to carve a new punch. So that's 400 years of type history, is all of these people carving punches. The pantograph is a way to trace something and cut or draw something to the other end. That's basically what it is. It's a mechanically connected process. And I should have an illustration here, which I don't, which is you see kids' toys like that. I had one as a kid. That's sort of a couple levers together, and you attach a thing and a pin in the middle, and you can make things drawn larger or smaller by tracing them. It's exactly what this was. But what the Benton machine is, it is a motorized device with a drill bit basically at the end, with a routing bit. So you're tracing a design which can be made much larger, and you make one of them for a whole range of type, and it can be reused forever because once you make these giant templates, you're no longer harming them. You're just tracing gently around them with this device, so they can last for. And I got to see some of these when I was at the Type Archive. In fact, also some of monotype matrices, and they're beautiful. I mean, they look like works of art, but they allow this mass production of different sizes of type, which reduced the craftsmanship of type by some amount, clearly. And there's a lot of issues and arguments about that, but it also allowed the production of much more type. And every punch could be essentially mechanically not identical, but very similar. And instead of carving 3-point type, you would draw something this big, and then you would use reductions in this with ears to carve the tops of 3-point type, and you'd make punches. So that's the key breakthrough. That breaks type at some level. And so one could argue at that point, the history of type ends. I don't really argue that. But you could say, if you're a purist at a certain level, you're saying the connection of the hand to the punch and then through these intermediate processes is suddenly, it's a different relationship. And it also creates a lot of different professions. So suddenly there are, instead of being one punch cutter who interprets designs and makes designs, you have a whole bunch of different people involved at different stages with drawing offices and matrix makers. And I was actually looking at drawings. Bertolt Volpe, this type designer, worked for Monotype. His emendations on proofs from the matrix department when they're cutting his spaces. He's like, no, this isn't good, and this isn't good. And there's this back and forth. He's having to work with them to execute his design, which can be frustrating, but it's also, again, different crafts involved. So it's not like it's a fight. It's more like just 20 or 30 people involved in this chain instead of one.
At what point did sort of like fonts as we know them today sort of explode? I mean, way back here you got to have, like, you can't have fonts in 3 billion sizes or whatever.
Well, this is part of it too. Is think if you have to carve every punch, and sometimes hundreds of punches for a single space of a single face, it limits it. Once you have this dramatically increases the amount of type that's made because it dramatically reduces the cost, and you need to make a lot more type because this is a huge industrial operation you're building. So suddenly you have to justify this massive amount of money you put into automatic type making. And in fact, a lot of type foundries go bankrupt, and there are collusion and all kinds of cartels, and it's incredibly disruptive in every possible direction, including to Benton, who invented the machines. He winds up allied with a group that does not do well. And so it allows the multiplication of type. So even though we think of that again as a digital thing, like once you design digitally, suddenly you could have 100 times or 1,000 times in fonts. The same thing happened then, is it dramatically increased the number of different sizes of faces, styles, and sheer quantity because you could cut them. I was just actually reading a book a couple days ago, History of 20th Century Type Designers, and there's a story in there about Gaudi, who has Bruce Rogers over. And Bruce Rogers complains he can't find a headline face he needs for a book cover. And Gaudi says, well, I can make it for you. He goes into his shop, he pulls out matrices for one of his faces, adjusts the pantograph, makes the size of type, makes the matrices that, pulls out the patterns rather, makes the matrices Rogers needs. He casts them, and he hands them off to him at the end of lunch. And he mutters, "Some service." I just thought, that's the speed of the thing. I mean, Gaudi is obviously mechanically very gifted, but it's sort of ridiculous too. Like the fact that he could just, let's go in the shop and whip you up some type at the size you need. That was a thing you could do.
But at some point, did type go from being a custom property of a particular designer, and that's the one who does it, to this more licensed kind of thing?
That's a long discussion, which I can answer questions about later, because that gets into intellectual property rights are still very complicated with it. Even reading that Gaudi thing, like somebody wanted Gaudi to cut a different face. He's like, oh, it's really owned by so-and-so. And they could have done it. It wouldn't have been illegal, but it would have been slightly unethical, but not entirely. So that is a whole morass, but worth thinking about. So you could create type much faster, and you could create, I talked about punches. The other thing you can create faster are matrices. So remember, a matrix is a kind of mold from which type is cast. But you're still, if you're thinking about it as a one-at-a-time operation, well, why do you need to cast matrices? Wouldn't it be better to cast punches, make a bunch of, cut punches, make a bunch of those, just have people working on it? Well, this ties in with the problem of typesetting, and the problem of typesetting was human beings. Typesetters simply could not typeset. Setters couldn't set type faster than the equivalent of maybe a page of a newspaper in a 10 or 12-hour shift, and they work these long shifts. They might be able to set a few pages of a book in that period of time. So, and even the fastest were called Swifts. They could only work at 2 to 3 times that rate, and they could only do that for sprints. And there were, in fact, typesetting races held around the countries in the mid-1800s, at which hundreds of people paid to watch people typeset super fast, because that's what people did then. So typesetters spent years training, and there were apprenticeships. They had to learn, because it's still kind of guild-ish, they had to learn how to do every kind of printing, even though they were being trained as typesetters. And there were never enough people in type, so type could be scarce, people could be scarce, and there's a huge human toll. I read a book this year that made me very sad. This one fact was in 1850, according to a Sick Benefits Association for typographers, a printer's average age was 28 when he died, 1850. Now the average death age of like an American man in that period was the 40s or 50s, so that was quite a bit younger. The working conditions were horrible, and they were literally asphyxiating themselves working by gaslight, which they preferred, while they're setting, and they're working crazy shifts, and they didn't sleep, and they drank all night, and it's all a crazy, crazy job. So it gradually increased, that death age happily increased to 40 years on average by 1893, and then shortly after that rose to kind of match the national average. So why did that happen? That was the invention of hot metal composition, and this allowed real-time typesetting. So if somebody sat at a keyboard, like at the right there, and they could tap away, and matrices, like in the middle, would fall down from this thing, a big magazine or cartridge full of matrices in it. You would tap, and they would fall down into an array. You pull a lever, you pull a lever, and metal would shoot out and cast a line of type, right? And you pull the slug out, and this dramatically improved the throughput. So people could suddenly typeset 4 or 5 times faster. It removed the issue of distributing type. It removed the issue of type wear, because every time you set type this way, you're setting fresh type for metal. You need a bazillion matrices, though, because all these new typesetting machines need to be fed with matrices. So fortunately, there was a machine to cut them. Without this machine, you couldn't have that one to the far right. And Linotype, I was reading something from the 1920s, they were cutting like 20 million matrices a year. And massive factories, and all people were doing, just cutting these things out. A very clever system. So part of my ongoing theme here, obviously, is that the process of making type is both similar to and divorced from the historic process. So it's a new set of processes for making something that looks the same, but is it the same, right? This is part of my thesis. So now we move very rapidly through the end of the 19th century, in which lithography returns. It had already been used for some kinds of printing, and then a happy accident. A printer was making check blanks in 1900, and they were using a rubber roller to kind of press this in, and they don't get the, they forget to put something in, and so the rubber part prints on the paper. They go, hey, that looks pretty good. Why are we going through all this extra process if we could just roll the plate onto rubber and then onto paper? We might have something there. And that very quickly becomes this whole new method of offset printing. So you don't print from a plate, you don't ink it up and print it directly to paper. You ink up a flat plate that has got properties, parts are attractive to ink and parts are not. You roll it onto a rubber roller, and the rubber roller rolls onto paper and offsets that image. And these are modern lithographic plates. And it's a photographic process. So this starts to bypass metal. So you can, printers learn to etch plates from photographic negatives. This gets all the toxic metals out of the process, many of the toxic metals out of the process, not all of them. It takes decades, but offset photolithography ultimately overpowers letterpress printing because it's simple to make thin plates that produce results that are good enough, have cost, time, and other advantages. Some newspapers continue to print with the relief method. Even until like the 1980s, some were still doing that in the US and Europe because they had such massive investment. They would still set everything using phototype, which was, again, a very similar process. They said, well, instead of carving type from these patterns you make, what if we drew patterns and we photographically reduced them and put them into film negatives that expose them onto film? Because we're already using photography to make these lithographic plates. We could obviously do that with type as well. So you can see a movie called Graphic Means. That's a terrific film. We do have, I think it's in May now, it's coming out digitally, that explains the entire transition between the hot metal era and the digital era, and it's really cool. So this is just a quote that I love because it's so dismissive and itchy about the change. The 1970s and 1980s, the practitioners of photocomposition and offset printing were, like Gutenberg, engaged in a simultaneously innovative and imitative act, but they were not imitating writing, they were imitating printing. And it's but it's also an extension of what people have been saying since the 1800s. This is from around 1990 edition of Short History of the Printed Word, or 2000 edition, Short History of the Printed Word. And I just love this kind of idea of that it's not really printing anymore. So Gutenberg was imitating one kind of thing, and now we're not even imitating it. What are we doing? We don't even know. It's a disconnection of the physical. So everything involving light eventually moves to digitally controlled lasers, because lasers are the ideal form of controlling light. I told you we get to lasers eventually. There's more lasers coming. So after about a 20-year transition, it's really as long as it took us from this photographic era of photocomposition and photolithography into a laser-driven one. And really, from what I can tell, I think it's been at least 20 years now since really printers almost, not entirely, but almost entirely, all the big ones, they actually output plates directly. They use plate setters, and they create the lithographic plates in one piece from digital files. So this is the modern flong table, is my contention, is that it's really the same thing. We're making duplicates, but our originals are digital, not metal, and we're producing a thing that gets reproduced. So, oh yeah, the book, that's right. So this talk was supposed to be in part about the book. That was a long digression, but the building blocks for understanding how I printed this book. I considered setting the book by hand, but very, very briefly, but I don't have access to enough type. I know Laughter. It's good. I don't have access to enough type in a font, and I don't even know who around here would have enough type to set a book in a typeface that would work for a book size. I'd have had to set pages, print them, make sure everything was perfect, and distribute the type and set the next next side of a brush sheet. This is how Walt Whitman, I discovered, set leaves of grass. People have all these fancy ideas. Why did he choose this size of paper? Why did he choose this typeface? Because a buddy of his in Brooklyn, who did a lot of business forms and other stuff, had a certain set of type and a certain size of paper, and they would go in there and set it like crazy and print a signature, and then they distribute all the type to do other stuff with, and then when they had the money and time, they print another. So, tradition of typesetting. I could have also tried to fund getting it set in hot metal, because there are many people, I keep finding every day, more and more people setting hot metal out there. There's these young guys in two sets of separate young guys in the north of England who are have monotype systems and are setting metal. I just discovered recently. There's a lot of it out there in places, surprising amount. And some of it's available commercially, you can contract it. But I just thought, I didn't look at it that seriously because, among other things, I did some of the calculations. I think it would have been about 40 feet of galleys, so like just linear feet of type, and it might have weighed maybe 2,000 pounds, possibly more. It just seemed unmanageable. So my only choice was photopolymer. And photopolymer is, again, we're in sort of this, it's a printing plate. It's just a different kind of printing plate, and it has modern origins. It's a light activated rosin. It's a plasticky substance that gets laid down evenly on a sheet, on a backing of either like a plastic or a metal. And when you expose, or you selectively expose it to light, say through a photographic negative, that's a reverse of what you want to print, the parts that are exposed harden, then you wash it out, this brushy kind of thing, and all the parts that are unexposed wash away, and you're left with this raised surface, which is ink receptive and can be paired with a base for letterpress printing, and voila, you can take a digital file, make a negative, and produce type, and that's what I did. It was developed for a different purpose for the packaging industry, like wallpaper and plastic bags, and this kind of general purpose area called flexography, but it's also available from, I use Boxcar Press, which is in Syracuse, New York, and they run a service bureau, and they're a letterpress printer, but this is a side business, and you send them material, and they send you photopolymer. And so it adds an analog element. There's a little bit of, they're very consistent, but it does add the variation of dealing with analog objects. And there are a lot of different feelings about photopolymer. And I think the split, and I'm quoting Jenny, who's here in the room, but I'm quoting you back to yourself, is that, I wrote an article for Wired, and what the feeling seems to be is some people don't like photopolymer because they feel it's a disconnection from this history of printing. And they'll turn to it only when necessary. And I think the split, maybe commercial versus artistic or personal, is if you have to achieve something, then you have to go to photopolymer because there's only a certain amount of metal or material you can get. And you can etch plates, and there's other things you can do. But in practical terms, photopolymer is affordable and available, and you can do anything you can do digitally, you can produce with it. If you're doing work on your own fine art work or work that has constraints, or that you intend to have constraints, then you don't have to use photopolymer. And many people therefore choose not to because they don't have to. And I think that's maybe a more time split, I don't know. In my case, I was trying to do something that at one level was a fine art project and kind of honored a tradition. At the other, to produce 100 unique art-worthy objects that could be produced in a finite amount of time. And I figured if I'd gone one of the other methods like hot metal, I would have had to probably charge $250 a copy. I don't know. For that difference, and maybe spend 6 months printing. Plus, Jenny would have had where am I going to put 40 feet of God? Would have been an unhappy situation. I don't think my wife would let me store them in the basement. Maybe.
Can you show the difference in the result?
That is a fantastic question. I've shown it to people. I used a modern face that I think got a nice evenness in color that holds up well in letterpress and with photopolymer, so it doesn't have a lot of contrast. There's not a lot of things in it at all. And I've had people say, did you do this in metal? I don't recognize the face. And I said, no, and then they look how even it is, and they see, oh, no, this is photopolymer. But I think you absolutely could tell the difference because there's a sort of super consistency to photopolymer because you're coming from a digital origin. Now, if somebody wanted to be really a smart ass, they could create a technique of rendering photopolymer so that it looked more varied, and then you wouldn't be able to tell as much.
But do you like print under pressure with it? Or is it softer than the metal, or is it?
It's pretty firm. Yeah, and you don't have to worry if you beat it up, you can just make more. So there's a cost associated. It's about 50 or 60 cents a square foot, so it's not cheap. On the other hand, if you bash metal, your metal's gone forever unless it's hot metal. You can get reset. And if you bash this, which I did at one point, you go and spend $50 and you get a new piece of it. Here's a close-up. Just you can see it's actually really beautiful. It's got a nice color and quality. It's kind of its own thing. I just thought I'd bring up in passing. This is just an image from Eric Spiekerman, as a graphic designer, 50-year career. Many of you probably know him. He wrote the book Stop Stealing Sheet. He had a long career in advertising and graphic design. He's a wonderfully cranky and happy, picky person, and very particular in his way, and but has wonderful results, and is very generous with his time and insight. And I did an interview with him and about this new project he had where he's calling digital letterpress. And he's he was a letterpress printer in the 1970s, and he moved his stuff. He was moving to London permanently, and he put his stuff in storage and went off on vacation with his family. It all was a fire, and everything melted and was turned into slag. And he walked away from letterpress and didn't touch it again until about 2010. And just, you know, he had a very happy career. It all worked out okay for him. Let's just say that. But so he's quasi-retired. He's still working harder than he ever has. And he decided to experiment with printing. He wanted to see, could we do letterpress? He has buddies with full-size Heidelberg presses. Could we do letterpress with modern digital techniques where we get the benefits of photopolymer, but we're not dealing with the irregularity of analog methods like making film and doing contact with the photopolymer material. So he has spent, what was it, 150,000 euros to buy and adapt a device, a laser exposing unit that's meant for the flexography industry. That's a slightly different technique, but it provides, he's adapted it so it lets him essentially cut 8 pages up at once for a medium format book with the kind of consistency he wants. And he prints it on a letterpress, a relatively high speed letterpress. You're seeing the outline up here. And we had this discussion about it. It's like he likes a kiss impression. Like he doesn't want, this is the ideal thing is for letterpress is not deep incised impression. In the old days, you didn't want to wear your type. You're just kissing the paper, right? And he likes that, but he also thinks that even with the slightest impression, you still get a sense of three-dimensionality with letterpress that you don't get with offset. And he also feels that the inks you can use with letterpress that work best with it have a darker, richer feel. So he's trying this, and it's very interesting. But he says, you know, it's not special. So the quote I like from him is, it's kind of half handmade. And I thought, that's kind of it. Like, what I did is not a fine arts book. Like, I've seen fine arts book, which people sometimes spend years, different components of it. What I did is not that. But what I did is something that involves a lot of hand effort and a lot of hand design. But it's both in both worlds, which I am as well. So I think it fits. I set the end papers in metal using a face called Stern, which was designed by the late Jim Rimmer in honor of the late Chris Stern. It has a lot of resonance in this community. I tried to set some ornaments alongside it, and for a whole bunch of reasons, I wound up using photopolymer for the ornaments that fit between this and the second color, because it wound up becoming a terrible time sink at the end. There's an Easter egg in the book, and my kids are here, so they will know this story already. My kids said, I'm nearing the end of the book, printing the book. They said, hey, you've got an article in the book about unintentionally or intentionally blank pages. You know, this page is intentionally left blank. I've got an article about the history of those and tracked it back with the help of some classicists in the 1400s. When paper was very expensive, why would there be any blank pages? And yet, sometimes there were. People wrote, nihil hic deest, nothing is lacking, right? Then really, it should be blank here. And I said, they said, are there blank pages in the book? And I said, yeah. They said, did you mark them as intentionally blank? I said, no, I didn't. They're like, well, maybe you should do something about that. So the very last minute, I set a very little bit of type, and there's an Easter egg in the book at the end. It just says, this page truly left blank intentionally. Some more lasers, because I promised lasers. There's even more lasers coming. Chapter numbers in the book and a tin on the cover are printed from wood, but this is a special kind of wood, I would say. So this is printed with wood that was cut out in a laser cutter from a local company that's down in Soto, Glow Forge, and they gave me a lot of access to their equipment so I could cut some stuff for the book. And so I cut the numbers, and that was a lot of fun. And then just printed directly from them, mounted them on a wood base, and So I have wood, a certain kind of wood, digital hybrid wood, and metal type and photopolymer in one book, which was lovely. And here's the thing I always come back to. This is from the Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum. It was at in November with several folks in the audience who were also there. And this is Georgie Brilski, the daughter of a woman who worked at this factory for a long time. And she's been trained to use the motorized pantograph to cut wood type, where again, it's tracing, it's a different kind of pantograph, but you're tracing a template and you're cutting wood. And it's the method that was developed in the 1800s. And the difference between that on the left and a laser cutting wood on the right, Jim Moran, who's the director of the Hamilton Museum, I talked to him about this, I don't think, a year before, and he said, the guy who founded it, Hamilton, he wouldn't have said, oh no, throw that laser cutter out, I don't want it. If he had it, he would have used it. He would have been delighted. This is a mechanical, industrial process, and without the fussiness that maybe we associate with part of it. So at some level, the difference between the two is not as big. Okay, some statistics. So I swear I'm rounding up here. Well, we're coming around the bend. So the book, a lot of numbers. 8 press sheets. Those are like 11 by 17 sheets. They're cut into folios. These are sheets that get folded in half. 32 leaves, so each part of the book, each page, both sides of the leaf. 64 pages. I estimate about 15,000 impressions, which is turning the crank from one end of the press to the other. And I had to do 2 hits of black on the black color. We couldn't get a dark enough black. So that added a number of impressions, but it got the right result. I estimate about 40,000 cranks to the press, somewhere in that range. And maybe 100, I had a Fitbit working at the time, about 100 miles of walking, somewhere in that range. It was really great. 6 weeks of printing, and I completely lost track of the number of hours. I've got no idea. It was an amazing process from start to finish, collecting the, it's going to load there, collecting paper, getting the paper cut down to size, all these things going on, right? Jules showing me some binding examples, me pulling the first sheet, my planning document, which is much more annotated now, checking backings for the front and backs are the same. This whole thing was just, sort of fast forwarding through many, many weeks of work and then packing everything up to go off and getting the first book back from Jules in bound format. And there it is. And I have book number 0, let's say, patient 0 to show you too. I sent out the first 30 copies in early December, a few internationally, and it's been so delightful to hear from people as they arrive. People are just happy to get this unique thing, and it's so wonderful. There's nothing better than sending out stuff you made, and I haven't had that feeling for a long time, because sending something digital just does not have the same impact. You hit that button, not the same as wrapping something up and sending it out. So, did I print a letterpress book? Yes, I printed a letterpress book. It's mostly photopolymer. Did I carry on the tradition of printing? I think absolutely, and I think there's part of why I wanted to explain the whole history of printing is I think it's fascinating to do the whole journey of it, because so much of it informed what I was doing before I knew it, and then as I'm printing and I'm learning this, I realize the deep roots in things that I'm doing I didn't even know. So I feel like at the end of the year, I felt like I was very true to the tradition of both the craft and the art of it, and it felt like a successful exercise in what I set out to do. Jenny will be laughing at me for including this picture because I gave her a hard time including it in a preview for this talk a few months ago. But I was embarrassed by that time. It's grown on me. These are the biceps I grew after all that crank training. They're kind of weak now, though. I don't know. I haven't been training for a while. But I was pretty buff there. Just 2 points in my body. Worth it. So the other goal, of course, was this is the other part. Is connecting to digital creators. And part of that was outreach for SBC as kind of my part of the bargain here, and part of it was me just loving to communicate and talk about all the stuff that I learned and know. And so I did, I'm a big social media person, so I was posting a zillion pictures on Instagram, on Twitter, getting involved in conversations there. I was on a few podcasts early on. I wrote a whole series of blog entries about the book as it went on. I had a lot of conversations with people all over Seattle. The Kickstarter campaign was good original outreach, and then Margot Atwell, who's the director of publishing at Kickstarter, came through Seattle. We did a talk here, did an interview with her, and had a great connection there. And I got to see her again at a Kickstarter event just a few months ago, which was neat to touch base. SVC has 2 events for letterpress related, and I was able to be part of both those, which was great. One is the Steamroller Smackdown, and if you're not aware of that, you should go this summer. It's just super fun, and it was the printing tent. where people can come and set type, and it was just so much fun to just sit there, especially little kids coming up, and these kids just covered in ink, and it was great. It was great. And the moms are like, how do I get, the dads are like, whatever. The mom's like, how do I get the ink? I'm like, oh, they'll never come off, don't worry. And Adobe Create featured a photo essay my friend Jeff Carlson shot. Before I started printing, he said, can I come in and shoot you printing? And I said, he said, maybe for stock photography or whatever. And I said, great. And so he came in the first day I was printing and set up and took a bazillion photos. And then he came in later as well and did another set when I was near the end. And so that photo essay ran, which was really, really neat. And then I taught a workshop with Jenny's help on laser cutting and letterpress. And if you want to know how exciting laser cutting is, this is the the ultimate picture there. So I'm sorry she's not here today. She had it just captures the whole thing. We had a great day. It was so much fun, and we produced so much work. It was amazing. And I did a lot of writing also, and so this is sort of part of outreach and part of just my career. There's tons of different articles. A 6-part series on printing revolutions for Medium, which covered Gutenberg to the present, letterpress revival story for Wired, which wound up being a nice calling card as I went places, because a lot of letterpress printers like, you wrote that Wired piece, I was able to show that to so-and-so, and they understand what we're doing and where things are going. Article about font detectives for Wired, people who research documents and testify about forgeries. I wrote a piece about Monotype's revival of Bertolt Wolpe's faces, which led to another great project. Eric Spiekerman's digital letterpress that was assigned, but it wound up being self-published, what he did. And then a heavily trafficked article on my website about N and M dashes. Go figure what people are interested in. And a short book. And so this resulted partly from, it's still in progress. This came out of the Volpe typefaces. Without going, I've already gone far longer than I intended here, but without going into further depth, I wound up going to see this unique exhibition of Bertolt Wolpe's work and papers. He passed away in 1989. He's a very influential type designer in England, and I decided to do a Kickstarter campaign to fund going and interview type designers and letterpress printers. And as part of it, I was able to visit unique collections that are not open to the public and typically not to researchers. I just kept bugging people, and finally like, all right, we'll let you in. And then had a great time when I was there and made lots of friends, made a dozen new friends or more, and may write another book as a result of it. This ebook that I've been calling London Kerning is my little joke there. Typographic perambulations around a city that remembers, and it's a short book. Short for me is getting longer and longer, but it's going to be kind of a little snapshot because unfortunately letterpress and printing is going away in London, and I feel like I'm capturing one of the last pieces of it. The 2 institutions I visited, they're terribly underfunded and almost collapsed a couple times, even one of them with government funding. And there's a concern that they may wind up being put in archives like far away from the city and being almost inaccessible. People are fighting that, but there's incredible development pressure there, as we've seen in Seattle as well. And also, one of the last I visited some of the last letterpress shops that are there and some small operations, and so much has changed. So this feels like I got to see a snapshot. People are, are happy about the growth there. But anyway, it was about 150 people backed this project, which was very modest, and about 200 people backed the letterpress book campaign, and that was just a wonderful, wonderful way to spend the year. One more side note: this was kind of fun. I took a type workshop here that Thomas Finney taught, 3-day workshop, and Thomas and a number of other people teach these workshops around the world. And to me, learning that Thomas is a font detective, so he testifies in cases about document validity, and people say, well, this, can you prove this will is forged? She's like, yes, because it's signed in 1986, or 1984, but the printer that made it was not manufactured until 1986, and I can prove why. Or this typeface, this E was actually a modification made in 2007, and the E was in this form, so it couldn't have been, and so forth. So just, the government of Pakistan fell because of a font issue this last year. And that was a good hook. There was a Justin Timberlake case in which 5-point shadowed type showing a credit could wind up being millions of dollars if the suits decided against Justin Timberlake and Will.i.am, I think, something. And Thomas is testifying in that. So that turned into one story. And then, so that's the font detective story. And then this woman in purple on the right, my classmate in that workshop, Darcy Werner. Well, it turns out that her son founded a business that's now worth $2 billion. They're doing about $2 million a year. And he founded it when he was 10 years old, about 4 years ago. And that turned into one of the most popular articles I wrote last year about Buttonsmith, this company in Carnation. And that led very likely to Henry, the man, being selected as one of the 30 under 30 in his entrepreneur category at Forbes, one of only 2 teenagers, which the family was delighted about. And then, of course, I also wrote this piece about Amazon's nonstop growth because I was here as well. So these are 3 of the most popular things that I wrote according to my editors, various publications this year, and they all arose from being here, 2 of them from that one. So community, I don't want to skip community before I finish here because community was a huge part of it. The letterpress community and the SVC community is warm and wonderful and welcoming and collaborative, and just met so many fantastic people, made so many friends, had so much time working with people side by side, pursuing, you know, artistic visions and just having fun and you know, shooting the breeze about things. And it was just great. It was a really rewarding. This is just a student one of the classes made all these. It's just unbelievable. It was just a rewarding year. It gave me an excuse to do some travel. I'm kind of locked into Seattle as a freelancer, and I took multiple trips this year. One to this Kickstarter event. This is the folding party. Oh my gosh, I forgot to have some names people to thank as well. But so I want to particularly thank, actually, I don't think Damien's here right now, but letterpress instructors at SBC. It's Amy Redmond, Damien Johnston, Ellie Matthews. Ellie and Jenny are both here. Thank you, Amy, are here. And the folks who came to help me fold the book, which is Elizabeth, Ann, Katie, Suki, Marie, Laura, and Jill. We had a folding party, and they came and we folded for hours and hours, and then we weren't done. So next week, some people came back and we folded more, and we weren't done. So I folded the rest at my house. That was just amazing. And met a bunch of people. Waze Goose, Astafi Kunis, Rikish man. And that's from the Hamilton event. Stephanie Carpenter in the middle works there. That's me in London. Having afternoon tea. It's kind of a good year. These are the folks that type archive. That's Griffel Volpa's youngest son. The whole very interesting trip. Went to 6 pubs in 5 days when I was there. I felt like the trip was a success. So let's see. And I also want to thank everyone at SBC who's been helpful. Jenny, Larry, and Linda I already thanked. At the outset, Mariette, Kathleen, Sam, Jessica, and Emily, incredibly helpful through the year, especially lifting heavy things. Did you know I'd have this many heavy things to move around? Had some extra help from a few companies who were not technically sponsors. They were just very helpful. Nina donated the paper, and Nina Paper has donated paper for many projects at SBC. It was very kind of them to give me a box, and their paper was wonderful and beautiful, and I can show you what I did with it. Boxcar gave me a very large fine art book discount on its photopolymer plates, which they often will do that for projects they think are meaningful, which was neat, and I was sending them a book. And then Glowforge, it's co-founded by a friend of mine, but nonetheless, he gave me a lot of access to their equipment and expertise and people, and a loan for our letterpress and laser cutting workshop. It's great. So as a letterpress printer, I should always be remembering a kiss impression, so you always finish with a nice kiss impression. But there's a great message I learned when I was in London, walking down the street with Berthold Wolf's son, Toby, and site designer Toshi Omagari, walking down the street, and I look up and I say, that's what I need to hear right now. Take courage. Courage is a beer brand, apparently. So there's a message to end with. And I know I've been longer than expected here, but people have questions about anything that I can address, and then we have, yes, sir.
So no matter how many times you proofread and how many people do it, and forward, backwards, sideways, something almost always seems to sneak through. You think sneak through?
So hard. I haven't got any. So this is actually a question that when you make something you feel like is a work of art, do people actually read it? So I don't know. I mean, and I mean that in a nice way. Like I don't know how many people actually read the book and how many people got it as. This is the if you make LPs as Kickstarter rewards, which a lot of people do. You know, they often get put up on the shelf. People play the MP3s, but they like the album art among other things. In fact, you could probably print blank albums and not even have a record, just have a blank cylinder inside. So far, no typos reported. It must be there.
John Gruber hasn't said that's a little too wide in the spacing there.
He didn't subscribe early enough. I got an author's proof that he
So you were saying with the metal type being poured in the north of England, do you see an eventual resurgence in the city of London, where it's probably because of property values?
Yeah. It's like Seattle. It's like imagine opening a metal foundry
Those
somewhere in
cottage
Seattle.
industries have had to exit.
Yeah, well,
Hopefully temporarily.
forever. I mean, it's forever unless things collapse. I mean, at some point there'll be some kind of something will happen in the cities, right? Like this, there's long-term trends, but I don't know what happens because these are already things. It's like artist lofts, like the periphery, just like everything else. Maybe a little bit differently because there's more nostalgia for it, and so people, I think landlords have often, and not everywhere, I realize, but in some places, landlords will cut people a little more slack because they're like, I really kind of like the fact that you're still doing this thing. And I've definitely heard that story in London a bit. One of the studios I visited, Graham Bignall, which is the New North Press, is what they run, and they did some very interesting 2D cutting and 3D extruding experiments. Lovely people. Graham bought the building a number of years ago in Shoreditch, which was like East Soho, I think. It used to be really run down, very unattractive, unwanted area. And then they said, oh, here, take a look at this book. And it was like The Artisans of East Soho. And it was like all these beautifully photographed, this very expensive book about all these craftspeople. And I said, they're like, well, this just came out a few years ago, and we're in it. I said, are any of these people still here? And like, no, they've kind of all been driven out because the photography was capturing the height of this, like the reason people were moving into the cute neighborhood, which then displaces all the people who are actually there doing things. So in fact, literally one of the outfits that's up in North Yorkshire is a printer named Phil Abel, who's running something called Hand and Eye Press. So he had a full monotype casting operation and also doing letterpress printing, and he had to move twice, and in his current place in that room. So a fellow who'd been working for him for years and working for the Type Archive in London as well, acquired his stuff and moved north where they could get cheap land. He and his wife live up there, and they're casting metal in North Yorkshire. Life cycle of a city. So maybe at some point there's overexpansion and then things go bad. We don't want things to go bad though, but if they go bad, that's when the artists come back.
They're just balanced.
Yeah, every secondary city is going to wind up, or tertiary city is going to wind up.
Yes.
Or something. Do they overwhelm anybody?
And then just curious if your book is being archived, written in here.
The letterpress book, I haven't thought about it. I mean, that's the funny part. Like, I will get a copy. Sandra Krupp at the University of Washington Rare Book Fine Arts Collection, I will give her a copy because she was very helpful and supportive. And so she can have it personally, but she may want it for the collection, but it's not exactly a fine art book. Like by the standards of what they have as fine art books, it's not. It's sort of an artifact almost rather than I mean, I'm not talking myself down, but it's not exactly within the definition of most fine art books that are done that way. So there's something about the amount of labor I put in maybe that makes it count. But I will definitely give her a copy. I haven't thought about others. I don't know what the final count will be. I have 100 dedicated. I've got some copies I need to give people, and then there'll be some number of artist proofs that I will keep some, and I will sell some of those as well.
That's a good question. What is fine art book? What is a fine art book?
Oh, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
You can have a fine art book and you can make it up.
Half handmade. That's why I like it. There's a lot of hand in that, but also a lot of. Right.
You have to carve each and punch it by hand. You want to call it fine art?
That's right. I need to go to the bowels of the earth and mine the ore and refine it. You know, there's a book called Toaster. Have you heard of this? Where a guy actually mined ore and then built it, like turned it into steel, and he built a toaster. It's a terrible toaster. But
one letter.
Oh, one letter. Yeah.
You have to do the whole process.
Exactly. I mean, it is like every aspect of this is endlessly fascinating. It's also like what part of creativity is Colonial Williamsburg, and we're just reinventing. You know, we're demonstrating. It's like, well, here are us doing the butter churn, and what part is real artistic expression that's meaningful in the world today? And I think Jenny has a wonderful talk about it. You can find it on YouTube or Creative Mornings. But I think letterpress has it. I think it's because it is so many hybrids. Like I was trained as a designer at a liberal arts college, so we had to have meaning in everything we did. We were supposed to not be trained with a craft. You can't go out of a liberal arts college with a craft. I managed to leave with a profession, gosh darn it. And but part of it was that tension between what is art and what is craft. And I kind of, in my mind, I always think craft is a little more practical, a little more hard-edged, a little more lean commercial. And it's like, we got to get something done. And art is like, well, we're going to spend all the time in the world thinking and looking at this and poking at stuff. I love where those two parts meet more than just being in the artistic world or just being in the craft world. I think letterpress is in a beautiful place because it's very hard to have a commercial part of it, but it's not solely non-commercial. It's just in a very difficult, interesting place, and I think it's on the verge of continuing changes because people keep rediscovering it and parts of it are being reinvented.
What was the most most joyous part of the process?
Finishing.
Is it seen in the rearview mirror as the joyous part?
Yeah, it was a great thing to do, and I'm really glad to be done with it. I'm not sure anyone else has ever, I would doubt anyone else has ever printed on that particular press, has printed a book before, certainly of this scale. I could be wrong,
No.
Probably not, right? And its history of 1946, I think, is that press. And it's not really a press designed to print a book, and we pulled it off. And I'm sort of proud of doing that, but also like it's so foolhardy at some level that I'm glad Jenny talked me into it now. I mean, you didn't exaggerate the difficulty. It was more like you can't know the physical effort. It was just a really exhausting thing to do, but it was great, and I'm so glad to be on the other side of it too. And I think I've used up all the time. I want to introduce somebody though, because we have it's the time to hand the torch off, which is I should put on. My official, it's the not the defrocking exactly, but on the, someone comes and cuts my tape off my shoulder. So this is the official letterpress designer in residence apron. Look, I can tie behind, this is what you learn as a letterpress printer, is how to tie behind the back. As a baker. And Claudia Castrolina come up, she's this year's 2018 designer in residence. Artist in residence, and thank you so much. I'm so excited to pass off because I think of myself. I'm a writer and I like what I do and I find meaning in what I do, but I find a lot more meaning in what we do. And I'm excited because I feel like we didn't know what this was going to be about. Jenny and I had ideas at the beginning of the year, and I feel like I put a massive amount of effort into it and just squeezed every ounce of what this meant to me for like 49 years of my life so far, but the rest of my life. So great. And I'm just so excited to see how you approach this because we're such different people and such different goals and interests, and it's so exciting to welcome you and to hand off.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's an amazing talk. I have to say, there are a few things in your presentation that struck me. The main one maybe being the words "take courage," because watching your presentation and the whole process and how you went about doing it, whoa, this is a daunting task. And Jenny and everyone here is so warm and amazing that when I get invited, approached to be the artist in residence, because I am a poet and come from a whole different background, interested in words, of course, but not printing them, like putting them on paper, certainly publishing, but not doing the printing myself. And so I got so excited about the process. I thought Jenny's wonderful. It was wonderful to think about it and to think of the possibilities and to talk with you about the project. So, but sitting here, I'm thinking, that will be my motto. Because the one thing that happened to me in the process of being approached and invited is that I have been named the new Washington State Poet Laureate. And so when I accepted to do this, I started thinking of projects that I could do, and now, of course, this land merges with another big project that I'll be doing for the next 2 years. This will be 1 year, and the Poet Laureateship lasts 2 years. But I thought the other interesting thing was that, so my project is one of thinking about, thinking about Washington State and thinking about points of arrival. And I talked to Jenny about it, and I thought it would be interesting to do a book, all the arrivals to Washington State, both human and non-human and nature-wise, plants that have come into Washington State and other species, and what we have become in the 130 years of statehood, and putting together a book that then can be donated to libraries across the state. And that is what the project will be. I don't have all the particulars, but that is the general idea, is writing a book that then could be shared with people across Washington that considers this idea of arrivals. But coming here tonight, I thought, what is it that I'm trying to do? And I wrote a line that then struck me when you opened your presentation. And my thought is, how do we imagine the future? How can we possibly imagine the future without considering the past as the driving force for these poems I will write? And what was your opening title of your presentation? But finding the future by living the past. Isn't that amazing?
That's incredible.
So I think that's hard. That's warming. That tells me that I'm perhaps in some way in a good place. That we are both thinking in similar ways. Although I think that the end result will be very different because we are different people and we come from different backgrounds. I'm certainly completely new to this process, so I'm very much looking forward to documenting. What you've done just with the documentation alone is amazing. So I look forward to reading along and reading, your writings on your process and consulting with you. And I think that you've set an extremely high bar for everybody else who will come thereafter, and how lucky that
I
is.
do about 100 shit, so there is that.
Hard work pays off, right? So anyhow, I'm looking forward to starting my term, my tenure, and hopefully being at the end of it with the same amount of satisfaction as you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.